everyone, this is Gwen. Welcome back to my sewing and DIY channel. The video today is a little different. I'm doing a deep dive into a sewing technique and showing you how to make perfect bound buttonholes. So bound buttonholes are also known as welt buttonholes. They're a great way to add a clean and professional finish to your outerwear like jackets and coats. But in this tutorial, I'm actually sewing bound buttonholes onto my corduroy jumper that I made a couple of weeks back using the Vintage Simplicity 7864 sewing pattern. So in this video tutorial, I'll be walking through the steps of marking the buttonholes, which is really important if you're using a button that's different from the size that's recommended by the sewing pattern. Number 2, sewing the bound buttonholes on the right side of the garment. And number 3, sewing the bound buttonholes on the facing of the garment. And at the end of the video, I'll also be talking about some differences that you might see in my tutorial versus other tutorials that you might find on the interwebs, and how you can change the technique a little bit to kind of suit your own sewing style and your own sewing preferences. Before we begin, let me just take a minute to go through the different parts of a bound buttonhole. So this rectangular boundary here is the buttonhole, and the two flaps that are in the buttonhole are called the lips. So we have the top lip and the bottom lip. And the button goes through the buttonhole like this. So we're going to start by marking the buttonholes on the garment. For my dress, the buttons are sewn on the left side and the buttonholes are sewn on the right side. And we will begin by marking the first buttonhole on the right side of the dress. The distance between the first buttonhole and the stitch line on the top of the garment is the width of your button. So to find out where your first buttonhole is, place your button right under the stitch line of the top of your garment. So I've placed my button right under the stitch line here, and the first buttonhole would be sitting right under the button over here. Using a sewing pin, make a temporary mark under the button. This pin represents the position of the first buttonhole. Once the position of the first buttonhole is identified, you can move on to finding out where you would like the rest of the buttonholes to be on your garment. This part requires a little bit of imagination, and I like to do this by placing the buttons down on the fabric and imagine how it would look on the finished product. Don't forget to take the hem allowance into consideration when deciding on the spacing between the buttonholes. And over here I've marked out the hemline using a yellow pin so that I can see how the buttons or buttonholes would space out between the hemline and the top of the garment. As a guide, standard buttonholes are placed about 2 to 3.5 inches apart, but this can vary depending on the buttons that you're using. Once you've reached a spacing that you find visually pleasing, measure the distance between each button and take the average of all the spacings. For my 1 1/8 inch wide gold buttons, I ended up with a spacing of 4 inches between the buttons. Next, mark the buttonholes on the wrong side of the fabric. Start by marking the first buttonhole, then follow that with the second, third, fourth, and subsequent buttonholes using the value of the spacing from the previous step. Bound buttonholes sit horizontally on the garment, and they start 1/8 of an inch from the other side of the center front line of the garment. The length of the buttonhole is the width of the button plus another 1/4 inch more for ease. Of course, this can also vary depending on the thickness of the button. I suggest doing a test buttonhole to decide if this 1/4 inch ease is enough for your button. Once you're done with drawing all the buttonhole lines, draw a rectangle around each buttonhole line. The width of the rectangle should be 3/8 of an inch, and the original buttonhole line should be sitting right in the middle of the rectangle. Next, using the same garment fabric, cut a 3 by 3 inch wide fabric square for each buttonhole that you're making. These fabric squares will form the lips of the bound buttonholes. Depending on the fabric that you're using, you might also want to add some interfacing to the fabric squares to give the lips a little bit more structure. We're now another step closer to actually doing some sewing. Before we do that, pin each fabric square over the position of each buttonhole on the right side of the garment. Make sure the surface area of each fabric square covers the entire length of each buttonhole. Next, with the wrong side of your garment facing up on the sewing machine, sew the fabric squares to the garment fabric by sewing along the outline of the buttonhole rectangles. Make sure you pivot your work at each corner and overlap the stitches at the start and end of each round to reinforce the stitches. If you want to be really precise in your sewing, you can even count the number of stitches that you have on the long edge and the short edge and use the same number every time. Now things are just starting to get a little bit more interesting here. Before cutting the bound buttonholes, draw triangles on each end of the rectangle. Next, using sharp fabric scissors, cut out the buttonholes using the following outline, which kind of looks like a double reverse arrowhead or a greeting card envelope. Work slowly and carefully and don't cut the stitches by mistake. At this stage, your buttonhole should look like this. If you ended up with some puckers in the corners of the buttonholes, it's probably because you didn't trim the triangles close enough to the corners. So try that again, and remember we want to trim as close as we can to the stitches without actually cutting the stitches. So at this stage, your buttonholes should look like this on the wrong side of your work, and we're going to get a couple of pins ready to make the lips of the bound buttonholes. Grab the part of the fabric square that's sitting above the buttonhole and fold it such that you create the top half of the bound buttonhole. And then fold the bottom portion of the fabric square upwards so that it meets with the top half lip of the bound buttonhole. The top lip and the bottom lip of the bound buttonhole should meet right in the middle. Pin the flaps in place and turn your work over to see if you like how the bound buttonhole is looking on the right side. Once you're happy with how the lips look on the bound buttonhole, baste these loose lips shut so they don't start singing and dancing when we're sewing them on the sewing machine later. If you're good at feeling things around with your fingers, then you might also find it easier to just create the lips with the right side of the work facing you, so you don't have to keep flipping the work back and forth just to check how the lips look. Next, you need to secure the bound buttonholes by sewing this little triangular flap on the sides to the fabric square, and this is how it looks. So with the right side of the work facing up, flip a little bit of the fabric over and you will see that triangular flap on the fabric square. We'll stitch a straight line down this way and make sure that all your stitches catch this little triangular flap and the flap is stitched to the fabric square. And this is how it looks on the other side of the bound buttonhole. There are a number of layers involved here, and this corduroy fabric is pretty bulky, so I'm just using the tip of a pair of scissors to help me push the fabric through. And you can see we're stitching a straight line down and making sure that the triangular flaps are stitched onto the fabric squares. And so that was the end of the first part of making the perfect bound buttonholes. At this stage, you should continue to sew the rest of your garment together. And in my case, I continued to put all the different pieces of this corduroy jumper together. And then I also attached the neck facing and the front facing and the armhole facings. And before sewing the hem of the dress, I proceeded with the second part of making the perfect bound buttonholes, which is creating the buttonholes in the facing of the dress. In this video, I'm sharing my preferred method of sewing the buttonholes in the facing of the garment, but at the end of the video, I'll also be sharing an alternative method to doing this. Before making the bound buttonholes in the facing of your garment, remove the basting stitches that are holding the lips of the bound buttonholes together. Next, cut the same number of 3 by 3 inch wide fabric squares, but this time in a lightweight fabric, and mark out a rectangle on each fabric square that is the same size as the bound buttonhole on the right side of the garment. I did this by first drawing the rectangle on a piece of paper, then placed a clear wrapping tape over it to reinforce the paper, and traced it out on the fabric squares by using a tracing wheel and a tracing paper. Next, pin the fabric squares on the facing of your garment. This part is a little tricky, so I'll take a little bit more time to explain it. You need to align the four corners of the rectangle on the fabric square with the four corners of the bound buttonhole on the right side of your garment. So over here you can see me using a sewing pin and piercing it through one corner of the fabric square on the facing of the garment, and then piercing it through the same corner through the right side of the garment. Once you're confident that all four corners are aligned, you can take another sewing pin and pin the fabric square onto just the facing layer of your garment. I usually use about 3 to 4 pins to secure the fabric square onto the facing layer for this step, and after securing the fabric square onto the facing layer, remove the 4 pins that you were using to anchor the 4 corners. Repeat the same process for all the fabric squares. Next, sew the fabric square onto just the facing layer of the garment by sewing along the outline of the buttonhole rectangle. And then just like before, draw the little triangles in the rectangles to make the reverse double arrowhead outline. Use a pair of sharp fabric scissors to cut along this outline and turn the fabric square onto the insides of the garment to reveal the rectangular buttonholes. Now hang in there and stay with me just a little bit more because we're really close to finishing our perfect bound buttonholes. Using a pair of fabric scissors, or in my case pinking shears, trim the fabric squares so that none of the fabric squares peek out from under the facing when you have the facing and the main side of the garment pinned together, like this. When pinning the facing to the right side of the garment, you should also make sure that the buttonholes on the facing and the buttonholes on the right side of the garment are aligned. And finally, hand sew the buttonholes in the facing to the buttonholes on the right side of the garment. I made visible slanted stitches on the wrong side of the garment, and in this case the facing. And when inserting the needle through the right side of the garment, I made invisible stitches by sneaking the thread along the outline of the bound buttonholes. So the stitches on the wrong side of the garment look like this, and you can't see the stitches on the right side of the garment. So congratulations on making this far into the video, and I hope you're not too intimidated by the prospect of making bound buttonholes. And right now I just want to go through 4 different ways in which you can modify your approach to sewing bound buttonholes and tailor it to your own sewing project. Number 1, fabric squares. A number of other tutorials that I've looked at before I started making my own bound buttonholes actually recommend cutting a 4 by 4 inch wide fabric square. And personally, I found that a little too big. So if you're on the fabric crunch, really 3 by 3 inch should work fine for a 1 inch wide button. I think the guide is to really make sure that you have at least about half an inch of fabric square next to the bound buttonholes to make sure that you have enough fabric to catch the triangular flap. And in one of the vintage simplicity sewing books that I own, they also talk about using the method of cutting a continuous strip of fabric rather than separate fabric squares as well. Number 2, size of the buttonholes. In my tutorial, I recommended the length of the buttonholes as the button width plus a 1/4 inch. But in a lot of other tutorials that I've looked at, they recommend the length of the buttonhole as the width of the button plus 3/8 of an inch. So it really all depends on 2 factors. Number 1, the weight of your fabric, and number 2, the thickness of your button. So the button that I used for my sewing project is about 1 1/8 inch wide. It's not too thick. And the fabric that I used is a medium weight corduroy fabric. So with these two combined, I found out that just adding a 1/4 inch more to the width of the button actually gave me the perfect length for my buttonholes. At the end of the day, it boils down to making a test buttonhole first to determine what's the best for your button and your fabric and your project before actually sewing on the garment itself. Number 3, buttonholes in the facing. So you don't actually have to make the same rectangular buttonholes with fabric squares like I did. You can simply cut a slit and slip stitch around the raw edge and call it a day. But I didn't take that approach because corduroy is a fabric that unravels really readily and easily, and I just didn't think that doing slip stitch around a raw edge would be enough to kind of keep the fabric in check. And last but not least, number 4, making the lips of the bound buttonholes. A few other tutorials that I've looked at also talk about a whole different approach to making the lips. So instead of folding the fabric square, they actually talk about making strips of fabric and cutting that fabric and sewing it onto the triangular flap to make the lips. I find that approach to be a little bit more fiddly. So anytime I have to deal with narrow strips and put different pieces together, I try to avoid that. And with the corduroy fabric that I used for my project, again, that would actually give me more raw edges to have to deal with. So that's an approach that I did not take. So I guess that's all I have to say about making bound buttonholes, and I just want to stress that not every single buttonhole is going to be perfect, but I hope my tutorial has helped you to gain a little bit more confidence in making bound buttonholes. They are all going to be a little different, just like how our faces are not symmetrical. Even when I put my brows on, the left is always a little different from the right. So if this is the first bound buttonhole tutorial that you've looked at, let me know if you found the tips easy enough to follow along. If this is not the first bound buttonhole tutorial that you've looked at, let me know if you've learned anything new or interesting from my tutorial. In any case, if you have enjoyed this little deep dive, please give my video a thumbs up. I'll be back with more sewing projects in the coming weeks. See you again next week!